John, thank you so much for agreeing to give up your Friday evening to join us on the Responsible Edge. You and I met just before Christmas, and it's been an absolute joy to get to know you and to understand a bit more about the work that you're working on, which is very aligned with obviously the stuff that we're doing. For our listeners that don't know you, it would be great if you could just provide an initial sort of introduction to you and your background and your experience, and particularly through the lens of corporate ethics, responsibility, and sustainability.
Yeah, absolutely. And thanks so much for having me. Really looking forward to where I think we're going to take this conversation. But to get us going, my background has always been in sustainability, sort of even before it was called that. So I think I'm going on 20 plus years now. But I think my journey was a little interesting. I started off in the public sector with the United Nations, moved into consulting after that, and then started my own practice as well. And over the past few years have really been focused on the governance side of sustainability, primarily through the lens of communications and greenwashing, absolutely as well. I've published a book on that. And even more recently, looking at sort of the corporate ethics of all of this and how companies and individuals within those companies say one thing and do another. But I think overall, I'm going to use an overused sustainability phrase, my theory of change is more grounded in my work in the developing world, which is where I've spent the majority of my career, versus more of, let's call it, and don't take offense, anybody listening, the academic discussions of the developed world. So much more of a get your hands dirty sort of approach to sustainability.
And John, that was absolutely beautifully introduced within like 2 minutes. Most guests have a full-on, well, not a nutshell, but that very much was a nutshell. But John, let's pry into this. So taking that point about working working on initiatives and working in opportunities within the developing world, what drew you to that? Was it simply that you did want to get your hands dirty, you wanted to see real impact and effect of the work that you were doing, but just touch on that for us. Like, what drew you to working in that space?
It was accidental, honestly. So after I left the United Nations in New York, went into consulting, as I mentioned, with a few of the big consulting firms. I went on a trip to Shanghai, just on a little vacation for the summer. And really, I'm not going to say I'm a Sinophile. I wouldn't go that far, but I really enjoyed the experience. And I went back to New York, and it was the height of the financial crisis, and everybody was really struggling. And I thought, well, you call yourself this global citizen, why not go give it a try? So I moved to Shanghai with the idea of maybe being there a year or two just to experience it. But what I had to do is figure out, okay, what do I do with all this public sector knowledge that I gained from the UN and other consultancies in a highly commercial city like Shanghai? I didn't want to work for the State Department. I didn't want to live in Beijing, which is where the Foreign Service is. So I had to figure out what to do. And that's how I fell into the realm of sustainability within the lens of the corporate sector. So I've spent my career essentially working only with the private sector, not with NGOs or anything of that nature since I left the UN. So that was the plan. Fell into sustainability, thought I would be in China for a year or two, and I was there for a decade. And I have no intentions of going back home to Los Angeles anytime soon, but that's really painted the approach. So not just working and living in a place like China, but also working within the region in economies like Thailand and Vietnam and India. So really very much the developing world sense. And that's where I sort of cut my chops when it comes to sustainability. So I would venture to say I don't even have much experience in the developed world. Even though I'm sitting in Melbourne, Australia now, my work still is very much through the lens of the developing world.
And is John, from a personal perspective, when you think about what you've achieved in your career so far, and you think about what you'd like to do with the rest of your career, is that in your mind where the real satisfaction is going to be drawn from? Is helping these developing nations the developing areas to essentially implement this stuff effectively? Is that a core part of the way that you view yourself and your role to play?
Absolutely. When it comes to sustainability, I sort of look at it through, well, kind of two roles. One is to simplify things. So if I'm talking to a general audience or even to other people in the field or people in the corporate sector, how do you boil this stuff down? That's like, we do highly complex work. People think it's easy and it's not. How do we boil it down to its common denominators, its simplest form, so people can actually then, my second approach to things, do something about it, right? We love to have conversations, but the time for conversations that passed by about 20 years ago. So it's well time to actually be doing things. So the way we do that, my view of the sustainability world is to make things simple, easy to understand, so they're easy to execute and implement. Or else, kind of, what are we doing?
Here, John. Out of interest, when you mentioned the book, you've written a couple of books, haven't you? It's not just the.
Yeah.
When did the inspiration for putting pen to paper in that kind of form? When did that come, and how did that fit into your view of your work and the impact that you were looking to have?
I've always sort of been a writer, and I think as somebody in the consulting space, we have a lot of thoughts and we do a lot of writing. And certainly going through school and master's degrees, you just get used to writing. So I've never found it to be a massive chore. And as I say that, somebody's probably listening, thinking, "Oh my God, you wrote books. How could that not be a chore?" And it is that part's a chore for sure. But there's lots of ideas and things that I just wanted to get out that I thought, and this is the same for any author. You think that nobody's done yet, and I would like to think that nobody's done what I've written on. So that was sort of the initial inspiration. The first book is really a back to basics guide for essentially the general public of how you can be more sustainable and the things that are sort of the myths of the sustainability world versus the things that actually do make impact. And then the second book, The Great Greenwashing, that came out sort of last year, that was really just me being so fed up with, as you can absolutely attest to, the massive increases in greenwashing over the past few years, and me just wanting to say something about it.
And John, picking up on that, because I think it is, again, it's very aligned to obviously what we're working on, and I think, the article that we're going to come on to talk about. Just talk to us about when you first became aware of greenwash or of corporate misinformation as a whole, and just talk us through since then what your experience of the phenomenon has been, and ultimately, if you can give our listeners a bit of a preview insight into last year's book, that would be really interesting too.
I think it's sort of ever present, right? I don't think it's a new thing. It absolutely is not a new thing. It's been around since the 60s and the 50s. But when you sit down as a sustainability consultant across from somebody, a C-suite person at a big Fortune 100 company, you start to listen to them and go, mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And you start to see through the facade quite quickly. And there's a lot of that. And some of it, not all greenwashing is built the same. There's accidental greenwashing, there's purposeful greenwashing, and there's lots of stuff that's in between. But you start to piece together, okay, not everything I'm getting on the surface is true. And then a lot of my work that wasn't spent inside and outside of factories was on reporting and transparency and materiality work. So the real nerdy governance side of sustainability, which I love. But then you start to read through enough reports and you go, oh my gosh, there's no way this is true. And I don't want to be a cynic, and I'm more of a pragmatic realist when it comes to this stuff. But greenwashing has always been there. Where we've really seen it ramping up, I think, at least in my little part of the sustainability universe, has been post-COVID. And yeah, I know we're still in the middle of a pandemic, but let's take 2002 as sort of the end of formal COVID. And a lot of companies have now really joined the bandwagon 30 years too late on the push towards a more sustainable type of development within their organizations. And because of that, we're seeing a lot of missteps, we're seeing a lot of lies, we're seeing a lot of purposeful greenwashing as well. And I think, unfortunately, that's then given the big boys who've been greenwashing for decades the leeway to increase what they're doing. So it's an unfortunate reality of where we are. Does this mean every company is bad? No. There's plenty of good companies. Does it mean every company is greenwashing? No, not really. A lot of them are, but I think there's enough accidental greenwashing going on that we can begin to fix a lot of the issues that we're facing. That was my greenwashing diatribe.
I loved it, John. It was so brilliantly placed. I just picking up on that last point, looking forward, what do you see the outlook being in terms of greenwashing, and how are we ultimately going to address these issues? You've mentioned about unintentional greenwashing. I almost, and again, I'm putting words in your mouth here, that's almost the low-hanging fruit, is it not, that we can look to address? But perhaps just give us a flavor of how you see the whole issue being addressed as we move forward.
Yeah, much like everything going on in our world, we're living in this really weird timeline that's a transition period. So the same thing is happening with greenwashing, where it's transitioning now, at least here in Australia. I know it's also happening in a few other developed markets, where greenwashing and sustainability communications has sort of boomerang back into the legal, public affairs, and comms space. And because of that, folks like legal teams are just basically saying, don't talk about sustainability, shut up. We don't want to be accused of doing the wrong thing. And so there's this absolute fear of talking about anything related to sustainability, which is the exact opposite direction of where we have been going and where we need to be going. We need more companies out loud, proud about the great things they're doing. And with all of that said, I'll caveat that with saying there's no such thing as a perfect company. I don't think anybody is of the illusion that there is. And once companies start to understand that they're not being asked for perfection, they're just being asked for honesty from stakeholders, things will start to change. So, to your question, I think the long term vision or where we're sort of going is we're in this transition phase. But I'm going to guess if I had a crystal ball, let's say 10 years from now, the companies that still engage in this sort of nefarious, purposeful greenwashing, there's not going to be much of a space for them anymore. And maybe I'm being too optimistic with that, but I think consumers have access to too much information to allow them to continue to be lied to from large corporations.
Which is obviously going to be an interesting theme that we come on to talk about, I think, in today's article. So I'll leave that there for now. But John, when you think about the end of your career, when you get to the end of your career and you look back on what you've done, what do you want to be able to say about what you did?
That's a deep one. I would love to say that I have, or the work I have done has inspired a better channel of communication and collaboration between the developed and the developing world. I think there's such a disconnect right now, not just from a corporate perspective, but I think from an individual consumer stakeholder perspective as well, where if you're somebody sitting in New York, things that happen in Bangladesh are further than arm's reach away from you, right? They just don't compute in your head. But at the end of the day, those two things are so intrinsically linked. What you do on one side of the world absolutely impacts what happens on the other. So if I can start to get people's minds shifted a little more towards that consciousness, that's a very overused sustainability term as well, but the consciousness that we're all sort of linked, I think I will have been successful.
And do you feel, John, that's a fast. To be honest with you, I love that response, because there are so many times that we have conversations with people where there isn't really a very specific focus for, I guess, the impact that they're looking to have. But I think that's a really interesting one.
Thank you.
Do you feel like that has been evolving though? Do you feel like we have a greater awareness of kind of the interconnectedness between us all individually in terms of our behaviors and our actions and the things that we do? Or do you feel like there's obviously a long way to go? What's your take on, especially perhaps just over the course of your career, the 20 years that you've worked in sustainability, do you feel like that dial is shifting or not?
I think it absolutely has. I think particularly over the past, let's say, about 5 years, the dial has absolutely shifted where people are more conscious of that interconnectedness. We're all sort of living on the same rock. We're all impacting each other in different ways. So the rise of having, again, access to information and being able to see that and then spreading that message on to other people so they can then see that is something that is a relatively new phenomenon. Certainly the past just year or two has that really ramped up. And I think that's been absolutely beneficial to helping change that mindset around what we're trying to do.
And on that point, John, just one last question on I think it's always interesting to get somebody who, as you say, when you started your career in sustainability, it wasn't called sustainability. So you're sort of, you've been at the cold face, if you like, of the evolving, sort of positioning of all of this. What are the key things that you've sort of observed about I'm going to call it the movement, if you like, the movement of sustainability since you started? Like, what state are we in? What report card mark would you give us, if you like, having looked at the last 20 years or so?
I wish I could say full marks for everybody, but that's clearly not the case, or we'd all be out of a job. I think, and I look through the lens of the corporate world, or actually, I'll back up a step. I look at sort of the three big stakeholders that can impact building a more sustainable future as being individual consumers, stakeholders, all of us, right? That's one part. You have politicians and you have the private sector. So if we look at those three in turn, the individual, we talk about people power and the bottom up approach and eco-activism, and all of that is amazing. And we've been doing it for 60 plus years, and there is absolutely a place for that. But I think given the scale of the issues that we face now, we can't just rely on people changing behavior and moving things forward. It, again, has its place, but it's not the be all and end all. On the other end of the spectrum, you have politicians who we know very well have washed their hands of trying to do anything. The Climate Action Tracker says there's exactly 0 countries on track to meet their Paris Agreement targets. So there's that. So then what do you have? You have the private sector. And the private sector is interesting because they have access to capital and resources and personnel that individuals and governments just don't have. So they're the ones that have really taken on pushing this development of a more sustainable future. And yeah, they're rightly vilified in a lot of ways, and some are praised, some aren't. But I think they've done that. And I'll keep using overused sustainability jargon because why not? We're amongst friends. But sustainability has now actually become embedded across the DNA of an organization, which is what we've been wanting to do for so long. And so we're finally there. These massive organizations are finally embedding sustainability across all departments. It's not just sitting in a single sustainability team or an ad hoc sustainability committee, right? Like these people are embedded in R&D and procurement and finance and legal teams. So it's spread out across the organization. That's where we are now. The question is, what do we do with that? And in talking, one of the roles I have, I lead a think tank called the Asia Sustainability Leaders Council. It's part of the conference board, if you have any Americans listening to this. And it's a group of CSOs from the region. We meet up in Singapore every once in a while, and we discuss basically what in the world is going on with sustainability. And within their organizations, they say the same thing. Yes, we've embedded sustainability across the DNA of our business, but we weren't quite ready for it to happen so fast. So now we don't know what we're doing. That's where we are.
Wow.
So we got what we wanted. We just weren't ready for it when it happened.
And how a $64 billion question or $1 trillion question here, but how is that addressed? Like, what is that part of the work that you're sort of focusing on at the moment is, okay, great, first step done, but now let's really work out how we're going to strategically implement this effectively. Is just touch on that for our listeners in terms of what you're doing to address that particular point.
Yeah, absolutely. So the 2 or 3 biggest burdens around that are headaches or things people bang their head against a wall on when it comes to that. One is resourcing and staffing. So you hear a lot, especially if you go to LinkedIn, green jobs this, green jobs that, because there are not enough people to fill these roles that we've created for ourselves that have the expertise that we need. So that's a big headache, is how do you resource? The second big headache is how do you deal with procurement? So how do you get the money to actually make these things happen? Because procurement has, especially in Asia Pacific, such a stranglehold on anything that happens in a business, or sort of the final gatekeeper, the final boss, if you will. And the final one is actually around reporting and communications, especially when it comes to greenwashing, when it comes to all of the regulatory frameworks that are coming out, especially from the EU and the UK. Businesses are really having a hard time navigating what to do about that. And so I joke, sort of half joke, that we've kind of become accountants, which is not exactly what we signed up for.
And on that point, which is you beautifully said, you're so easy to interview, John. I love this. You beautifully segued me into my next question, which is, are you, in light of that state of play, the fact that we've become accountants and less creative innovators and problem solvers that probably we need to be, how hopeful are you more generally about the sustainability agenda and its capacity to within the private sector? You described that so beautifully in terms of the role of politicians and government and the individual and the consumer, and then the role of the private sector. How confident and hopeful are you in the private sector that it will get this right?
Looking back into that crystal ball I mentioned a little while ago, I really do believe that if we fast forward 15 years into the future and we place ourselves in a supermarket just looking at the shelf, the choices that we'll have in front of us will 95% be sustainable, good for the planet, good for you choices. Because those companies that haven't played ball, certainly to date now, but certainly 15 years into the future, there won't be a place for them. The consumers there'll be backlash against them. They will need to update their business model somehow, or they'll go defunct. So all the work will have been done sort of behind the scenes. So by the time you get to the shelf as a consumer, you can just say, oh, all the choices I have are good. I just need to make a choice. And I understand right now that's not where things are. We have to do research. We have to pay more. And God, I hate doing that. And if I care and I don't want to do it, I get that the average punter absolutely does not want to do that. So I totally understand, but the world is changing so quickly, and certainly the sustainability space is changing so quickly as well, that 15 years into the future, that's not going to be the case anymore. So the private sector will continue to drive things. Now, does that mean everything is going to be perfect? No. We're absolutely going to have the highly polluting organizations and companies in sort of the oil, gas, mining, these sort of industries will absolutely still be around. And they are, at this stage of the game, a necessary evil. Again, pragmatic altruist, I understand that we're going through a transition period. So they're still going to be around. We're not getting rid of them anytime soon. But for the broad scope of sustainability, I think just getting the consumer goods part of the private sector moving in the right direction and changing, like I hope they will in 15 years or over the course of 15 years, will go a massive way towards helping build a more sustainable future.
John, I love to leave it on a bit of pragmatic optimism, if you like, this first section. That was brilliant. And I know we haven't done justice to going in and prying into all the different areas of your career. But for anyone that's interested, we will certainly...
Thank God. Please don't.
Stop it. We will certainly be linking to John's books and to his LinkedIn profile, so you guys can go and check out all the wonderful things that John's been involved in. Moving on though, John, would you mind possibly providing a bit of a summary, a bit of an overview of, I think it was Peter, I'm going to butcher his last name, Wiener, article in The Atlantic from the end of last year. Would you mind just summarizing that for our listeners, and then perhaps just picking out for you whatever the most interesting points were?
I will try to summarize it in an unbiased way, because the article certainly gave me feelings. So the article was about the United Healthcare CEO Brian Thompson's assassination, and Luigi Mangione, who is the supposed assassin, and how, and I'll say this as the author said it, as he framed it, even though I don't agree with it, how the general public has essentially created a folk hero in Luigi Mangione, and that there is no reason we should be praising murderers, because at the end of the day, United Healthcare is just let's call it a cog in the wheel of the United States healthcare system, and there's not actually much that they as an individual company can do to change things, and there's certainly not anything that Luigi Mangione, if he is the assassin, let's just call it the assassin, not Luigi, because it's not confirmed, there's nothing that one assassination will do to change the system as well. So he takes beef with anybody who basically said this was an okay thing to have happened.
And you mentioned it stimulated an emotive response in you.
That was a very diplomatic. You have a career at the UN coming up. That was a very diplomatic way of saying that. Yeah. Yes, and it's interesting that you sent through that article, and I think we discussed it a little bit late last year as to why. Because I am working on a third book, shameless plug, called "Eat the Rich," which is all about the unethical behavior of basically the 1%, the ultra billionaires of the world. And that's an extension of the Greenwashing book, a section in there that I didn't feel I gave much justice to. So the introduction to Eat the Rich is all about the assassination, because I think it's obviously very timely and topical. So I have lots of feelings about the way the information was presented. And I think overall, when it comes to the article and the way it was presented, I think there was a misunderstanding or a misrepresentation of what people are feeling. And I certainly do think that Luigi Mangione has been held up as this kind of folk hero, certainly, but I do not think the majority of people are praising the death of a person. I don't think anybody is going out and asking for vigilante justice, because if that was the case, it would already be happening, and it's not. And people still have a moral compass, which I think the author certainly implied people do not have a moral compass anymore. And I'll get into the author in a second, because I did take some notes that I'm looking off screen at right now. But I think that's really the issue that I take with it. And certainly the author's approach of just laying back and saying, oh, well, that's just the system. That's just the way it is, right? You can't do anything about it. And what good, I mean, certainly people in our space, if we had that kind of attitude to things, nothing would ever happen. So it's very much and I hope nobody takes offense, even though if you are this, please do take offense, a very boomerish attitude towards things of, oh, well, that's just the way it was done in my day, so why don't you just lay back and take it, which is not okay, especially in a system like the United States healthcare system, which is just boggles the mind that it can even exist in a developed country, any country in this day and age. So The piece also goes into this idea of what's called social murder, which is a German concept. I forget who created it, but essentially social murder. Can I say murder on this
Of
podcast?
course.
Okay, cool.
You can say
So
much worse, John. You go
okay,
ahead.
good. Then I might. So, social murder is this idea that there are premature deaths in societies because of things like poverty, a lack of affordable healthcare. These are all premature deaths. And if we look at Brian Thompson as the leader of an organization that contributes to a massive amount of premature death, societal murder, then I suppose the question becomes, is the death of one man at the helm of this very evil organization, and we'll get to the organization in a sec, is that okay, given all of the negative impact that that organization has had? Because United Healthcare is not just a small healthcare company, they're the world's ninth largest company. They have the most coverage of any healthcare company in the United States. They cover something like 50 million Americans. So when this guy was in charge, he oversaw a company that basically had doubled the rate of denials of claims compared to any of their peers. He was just going left, right, and center, just saying, no, 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 we're not covering you, we're not going to do our job. We'll gladly take your money, but we're not going to pay out when you actually need care. And there's plenty of horrific stories that people can certainly Google and find themselves around how, I'll say it, this is a very evil company, and he was at the helm of that. So where does the responsibility lie? I mean, we're talking about, and I'm going to look down at my notes because this is really important to get right. Up to 90% of their claims, of people's claims, were denied by a system that was faulty, and it's been found to be faulty. So they police mental health care with arbitrary thresholds. They have an illegal software algorithm that they continue to use that's been found illegal by the US justice system. They've been investigated by the Department of Justice for antitrust issues and knowingly ignoring information about medical conditions. They also inflated returns to themselves on the order of $1 billion in 2017 alone. They have billing irregularities that led to an additional 3.7 million, or excuse me, billion with a B, getting brought back to the organization. And since 2000, United Health Group has received penalties totaling over $2 billion. That makes them one of the 60 most penalized companies in the world. So to say they're an innocent company that has no control over a very flawed system is just, it boggles the mind. This is not an innocent company, and the person that, I don't advocate for violence, I don't advocate for murder, obviously, but like where does the responsibility lay, and what do you do when you can put yourself in these people's shoes? Somebody that probably had been denied healthcare by this organization, probably could have been in a very terrible situation, terrible predicament. We don't know. Takes out a little bit of vigilante justice, and then that justice in turn starts to actually immediately change things. Because you usually see something like this happen. You see not necessarily an assassination, but something big happens. It's newsworthy. It hits the news and it goes away pretty quickly, and nothing changes. Within 24 hours of Brian Thompson's murder, some of the large medical companies were starting to change their procedures and what they would claim and what they wouldn't claim. So there was one, and I'm not going to mention the name because I don't recall which company it is, so I don't want to get you sued. But they had a policy in place. It was about to go into effect in 2025 that basically said they wouldn't cover full procedures of anesthesia. So that could mean, in a worst case scenario, you could be halfway through your procedure, be brought back out to have to sign a form, to have to pay more because the coverage wasn't going to be done by the medical company. Within 24 hours of the assassination, that medical company, they changed that policy. Said, oh, no, we're not going to do that anymore. So immediate change. And of course, they said, it wasn't because of that, but obviously it was. So, we're starting to see changes because of that. Again, I don't advocate for vigilante justice, but sometimes an eye for an eye.
And John, that's what's so difficult about this, isn't it? Because I mean, again, not condoning violence in any way, but in a sense, it's worked. The attention that has been drawn to the issue, and as you say, look at the healthcare system through this prism, and globally, I would say as well. I think that's the other thing is, you're sat there in Australia. This went around the world in a big way, and from a US perspective, it's not a good look, and it's the eyes on a system which, as you've alluded to, the system itself from a lot of other parts of the world looks fundamentally flawed, not just the actors that play within it.
And profit from it, which I think is the thing that gets people as well, is while 90% of the American population is doing it really tough, they don't have coverage, they can't get basic medical care. These people are living high off the hog, profit, especially in the healthcare area, profiting off of pain, sorrow, and death, which is, I mean, it's twisted. And I'll add one more thing if we have a sec about the author himself, because it's always interesting, especially anytime I read something, I always check who wrote it and why.
Mm-hmm.
So this guy, Peter Wiener, he's a devout Christian, that's fine, freedom of religion, and a Tea Party Republican. His writing always focuses on domestic policy through the lens of Christian values. So that's kind of how the article was framed as well. And he has a moralist bent. So basically looking at traditional Christian values and how that should influence people's thinking. So obviously a bent and a slant, and that's fine. Every journalist has one. But if you look into his background, he was executive director of policy for Empower America, which was a conservative think tank that was funded by the Koch brothers. The Koch brothers have extreme ties to the oil lobby and to very climate change denial sort of stances and organizations. And so this guy is very pro-business. So obviously that's going to come through in the way he presents things and the articles that he writes for prominent news pieces like The Atlantic.
John, you are a bit of a Poirot, clearly, because that's
Poirot.
Oh, I love it. I love it. No, but I think that's such important context. And I think it makes so much sense of essentially, the sort of finger wagging, if you like, that goes into that was in that piece. The overarching kind of feeling was, no, as you've alluded to before, the systems aren't there to change. This is about the individual taking responsibility for behaving in a correct human. I thought it was so interesting, the title, Dehumanization. You just think how incredibly interesting he used that terminology when you can literally flip the thing on the head and as you've alluded to, look at it from the other perspective, which is what I'm kind of keen to do now. So taking that position, and we've sort of analyzed it quite nicely, from a corporate point of view, and sort of peering into the book that you've teased that you're writing now, like what role do corporates play, or can corporates play, in trying to mitigate this sort of reaction, this sort of experience of broader stakeholders, of them as an organization or them as a sector? If historically there have been problems around the way that sector or that individual organization has operated, what can you learn and what can you take from this in terms of lessons for corporates?
Absolutely. For me, it all comes down to ultimate transparency. So if I'm getting up in front of a group of executives or I'm speaking at a conference, I will say this, and inevitably half or more of the audience will sort of smirk and laugh. But I always say, if you want to do the right thing, you have to be, as a business, 100% transparent. I know that's a big ask. I know it's an impossible ask. But again, like we talked about a little while ago, stakeholders don't expect you to be perfect. They just don't want you to lie to them. And it just comes back, if we're talking about the moralist bent to things, just don't lie. Just be honest. You can be honest and a corporation and make money and do good things for the planet all at the same time. There's plenty of examples of companies that have done that. Where companies get tripped up and where they get into trouble is when they try to either outwardly lie or try to fluff or obfuscate, right? That's all times where people then go, wait a minute, you're not trustworthy anymore. And then the problems compound. So you put all your cards on the table. There can't be any gotcha moments. There can't be any confusion or misunderstanding about what you're trying to do and why it's been done. Even if there are missteps in an organization, companies always make mistakes, but the companies that are able to overcome those mistakes are the ones that get out in front of it and say, yep, sorry, we messed up. My favorite example of that is from the 2017 Oscars, the Academy Awards. So for anybody who remembers that, Warren Beatty gets up to do the presentation for the movie of the year, the big award of the night, right? Everybody's been waiting for hours. They're probably exhausted. He gets up and he opens the envelope and he announces the wrong movie. It was a big deal. And PwC was on the hook for that because they tabulate the results and hand out the envelopes. They got up that night, held a press conference and said, yeah, whoops, sorry, we screwed up. We won't do it again. And with the exception of us laughing about it now, nobody really remembers it. Had they hidden things, I was going to give a royal family example, but I won't since you're in the UK. Had they hidden things from the public for a long time, it just adds to allure and mystery and confusion and anger at the end of the day. So honesty, always the best policy.
And particularly because applying that to the healthcare system in the US, like how bad has, and you touched on it before, but how bad and how wrong has the healthcare system, and in particular, if you do have any examples of United Healthcare, like How badly have they got it wrong in light of what you've just said?
Very wrong. So, and saying this through the lens of I haven't lived in the United States for 15 plus years now, so I'm obviously not part of their amazing healthcare system. No, I have universal healthcare in Australia, which is great. So, to rub it in all the Americans' faces, they're listening. No, the entire system itself is flawed from the very base. It's sort of rotten to the core. So these organizations that work within the realm of privatized medicine are doing what corporations do. Corporations are meant to make money. That's their purpose, to increase stakeholder and shareholder value. As we always say. So they're doing exactly what they're meant to do, capitalizing on a system that allows them to do it. So they're functioning perfectly fine. For the individual consumer, which we shouldn't even call it that, the individual human being that needs healthcare, obviously that makes it extremely problematic to be able to get the coverage they need, especially if they're low income, if they're out of work, because a lot of healthcare in the United States is tied to employment. So it just has so many knock-on effects that then negatively impact health, mental health, physical health, which then circles back to not having coverage, which then circles back to healthcare issues. So it's this thing that is so intrinsically just wrong, designed and flawed, that what the solution is, to back to that article, I don't know what the solution is, and I don't know how we're going to create a solution for that, but a solution needs to happen because the US is the only developed economy without some form of universal healthcare. But at the same time as it doesn't have universal healthcare, it also has the highest spending on medical and healthcare. So how can that be? You spend the most, but you have the worst returns. Seems like a really bad sort of investment.
It certainly does. It certainly does, John. And thank you for the whistle stop tour. Let me ask you though, taking the healthcare industry in the US, but also thinking about other industries, if you like. You alluded to some before, mining, the fossil fuel industries, etc. Taking your suggested position of transparency and openness, and being upfront and proactive disclosure, all of those sorts of approaches. How do you advise an organization who's currently operating in one of these? Somebody used the term dirty industries, if you like. How do you advise them to approach the way that they communicate now and moving forward? What do they do? Because surely they're in it, or to play devil's advocate, they're in a position where they can never get it right.
They can never get it right. And I think that's part of the story as well. I think when we talk about sustainable business, we assume that all businesses should be sustainable, and that's not really the case. There are unsustainable businesses that no matter what they do, bar closing their doors or changing their entire business model, they can't be sustainable. So we shouldn't expect them to be. Oil and gas, fossil fuels are a great example of that. We cannot expect the fossil fuel industry to be sustainable because at its core, it's an unsustainable business model. Defense, tobacco, firearms, none of these things can be sustainable. So the more we approach them and say, hey, you need to be sustainable, we're just running a fool's errand because it's not the case. But as I say that, areas like fossil fuels, there are fossil fuel companies, they're a very small portion, that are genuinely trying to change their business model. So those are the ones we should be looking at, the ones that are trying to entirely diversify away from fossil fuels, oil, gas, these sorts of things, so that they can be more sustainable for the future. And of course, this is moving the needle in a very slow way towards change because they're going from really dirty to kind of dirty, eventually to semi-dirty, to maybe not dirty at all, but we're talking, 100 years into the future. So for those companies that are genuine, and this has always been my approach towards what clients I work with and who I don't, is what are your actual intentions? Do you mean this, or is it through greenwashing that you're trying to do this? And if you are genuine, okay, I feel, and I think a lot of people in the space will probably disagree with me, that it's sort of on me to help guide you through that journey if you are genuine. If you're actually trying to change, I shouldn't be there with a megaphone vilifying you and pointing out all the wrong things, because that's easy to do. The hard but more interesting and more fulfilling part is to help them change, with the understanding, of course, that even if we get them to that next stage of evolution, call it green evolution. Ew, I hate saying that. But say we do that, they're still not going to be entirely sustainable, and that's okay. We just have to adjust expectations a bit.
John, when that was beautifully positioned. How when you say that you only work with companies that are organizations that are looking to enact this genuinely and have a genuine intention. How do you determine that?
Gut feeling is always trust your gut, and especially, I mean, if we take a step back and we look at sort of industry writ large, really there's only like 20-ish industry sectors, honestly. Some are much further along in their sustainability journeys. Usually they're highly regulated industries, med tech, medical, healthcare, legal, financial, all of those sorts of industries are far along, so you can trust that they're going to be approaching you genuinely because they have to or they get shut down. Then on the other end, you have the unsustainable ones that we already mentioned. So within that, you have to be highly suspect of what they're doing. So clients I will not work with are in defense, tobacco, firearms. That if you kill people, you can't be sustainable. Sorry, that's just not how it works. So it's sort of the basics, right? So there's those that you just cannot work with. But I think within the lens of fossil fuels, oil, gas, there is a small amount of leeway to be having conversations. And I don't do it very often. Very rarely. I think I can count 2 times I've ever worked with a fossil fuel client. It's extremely rare, but you really have to have your guard up as to why it's happening, and not just at the beginning of the engagement, but throughout the engagement as well, to see what the true intentions are with the organization. Everything else, all the other, I don't know, 12, 13 different industries are kind of stuck in the middle at varying degrees of their sustainability journey. With the exception of fast fashion, which honestly, I feel fashion in general, but particularly fast fashion, is sort of teetering on the edge of it could go into the unsustainable category like fossil fuels, or they could teeter themselves back into sort of the sustainable realm that we can actually do something helpful about. Not quite sure yet.
That John, that's fascinating. Let me pick you up on that. How do you envisage fast fashion? And again, I'm not a fashion expert, so I might be getting my terminologies or my understanding wrong here. But how does fast fashion, which in my mind is inherently unsustainable, how would that become sustainable?
Yeah, so and it's important. The terminologies are all obviously very important. So fashion is a large industry, and within that, there's a subset of fast fashion, which is all the stuff we see on the high street, right? The H&Ms, the Zaras, et cetera, et cetera. By their business model and the way it was created by Zara and H&M way back in the day is more faster, and that leads to huge amounts of waste. A statistic I saw recently is something on the order of every 7 minutes a pile of clothes the height of Mount Everest is thrown out. Yeah, chew on that
Wow.
one for a minute.
Yeah.
So and 99.9% of that is going to be from fast fashion. So the amount that they produce is eye watering. How they could create a more sustainable model for themselves is certainly to pare back the amount of stuff that they're creating and how they create it. And we're starting to see that a bit, not to the amount that I would like to see from the big fast fashion houses. So Uniqlo is a great example. Fast fashion is no fast fashion. What is the name of their parent company? Anyways, Uniqlo is a good example of a company trying to be a little bit better given the model that they operate within. H&M is awful company. H&M and Zara, just absolutely terrible. If you have an option, do not shop at them because they're not doing great things. So that's why I'm sort of on the fence of which direction is it going to go, because you have some players doing the right thing, you have others still not doing the right thing. And underpinning all of this, not just in fashion, but in general in business, is you have all the people making the stuff.
Mhm.
So we have to really consider them. And I know when people talk about sustainability, 9 times out of 10, they're going to say, oh, the trees or the polar bears. Yeah, that's a part of it, but people are a big, important part of it too. So all of the workers, the logistics, the supply chain, everything that goes in, and this goes back to my experience in the developing world, in and out of more factories than I care to remember. What are you doing with all your people? How are you treating them? How are you remunerating them? What do you give them that makes them want to work there and gives them a great life outside of their working hours? So it's really important to consider that as well. So I say that with this sort of notion in the back of my head that I should have said at the beginning is, for example, if we say Zara, awful with the amount of junk they produce, or a Shein, they produce so much junk. But as they're producing all their junk, maybe they've found a way to pay their workers a living wage in Tunisia. And now all of a sudden those people are, living well above the poverty line where maybe before they weren't. on balance, does that mean Zara is a good company? No, maybe not, but they're doing better. So that's sort of this veering to the more sustainable. Right now, they don't do that. There are reports from places like Tunisia and Morocco and other places in North Africa of people being timed by the minute to produce ridiculous amounts of clothing and being paid essentially a few euros a year for it. So we're not there yet, but these things are not, to get them going, is not going to be earth shattering. It's not going to be something that a business would sit back and go, oh, we can't do that. They're very simple fixes. I say that and I sort of laugh in the back of my head that, of course, they're not simple, but they're simple enough to start doing. I don't know if that answered your question at all. That was, again, me on a soapbox.
No, John, that was absolutely brilliant. Sorry, I just threw please analyze the fashion industry in one foul swoop. But this has been an absolutely fantastic conversation. I've learned a great deal. I've loved it. We've absolutely flown through our 46 minutes or so I think we've had so far. I'm going to conclude now with the magic wand question. So, John, if I was to hand you a magic wand and you could change one thing about the commercial world this instant, what would that one thing be?
We've talked about it. Transparency, transparency, transparency. I can't bang on about that enough. Just, just wave that magic wand and get everybody telling the truth. Wasn't there a movie like that with Jim Carrey where he couldn't lie? Like, just
Liar,
do
liar.
that. Liar, liar. That's it. Yeah.
Liar,
So
liar.
just have the liar, liar magic wand, and then everybody has to tell the truth. We would accomplish so much more, so much quicker.
I love that. We've definitely not had a magic wand that's been inspired by Jim Carrey and Liar Liar. That is new. But I'm with you. The simplicity, but the effect of that in a crystal ball sort of world would be so significant. We would all be able to make truly informed decisions about where we align our resources and attention, and I think that would be transformational. So I'm absolutely with you, John. That was fantastic. Thank you so much for giving us some of your time. It was a brilliant show. Appreciate you coming on.
Absolutely. Thank you.
And that's it for today's episode of The Responsible Edge. A big thank you to John Pabon, sustainability consultant, author, and UN advisor, for joining us. John's expertise provided profound insights as we unpacked themes from Peter Wooner's Atlantic article, An Astonishing Level of Dehumanization, exploring the intersections of corporate ethics, societal accountability, and the consequences of dehumanizing rhetoric, and some alternative views as well. This episode was brought to you by the Anti-Greenwash Charter, championing ethical and responsible sustainability communications. Visit antigreenwashcharter.com to learn more. I'm Charlie Martin. Thanks for listening. And don't forget to subscribe, share, and leave us a review. See you next time.